All right, so we're picking up our next section now, and we're going to start from here on out looking at just the seed plants. So we're going to be dealing with gymnosperms and angiosperms, plants which probably to most of us are quite a bit more familiar than just about anything else we've seen so far. I mean, most people have a general kind of an idea what a moss or a fern is, but when it comes to looking at things like pine trees and all kinds of flowering plants, my suspicion is those are probably a bit more familiar to us than some of the earlier, more primitive plants that we've looked at so far. So the seed plants first showed up around 300 to about 465 million years ago. They were initially starting off as what was called a progymnosperm, which is essentially a pre-version of modern day gymnosperms, more primitive, more simple, those kinds of things, but still eventually gave rise to seed plants. Now, the seed itself, and I talked about this in a previous section, the whole baby plant in a box with its lunch thing, is that it allows protection for the embryo. All right, so protection from all kinds of environmental factors, from heat, from cold, from desiccation or drying out, from herbivores, from UV light, all kinds of things can be protected against if you actually have a seed coat around the embryo itself. And so seeds really allow the plants to get through the hard times and survive to a point when conditions might be favorable, if not ideal, for the plants to begin to germinate. Because remember, a baby plant is really not that much different from a baby animal in the fact that it doesn't have a whole lot of protection around it. So if conditions are less than perfect, having a bit of a layer of protection around the embryo is never a bad idea to have. So that's something that all the seed plants have, and even later seed plants like the angiosperms are going to have fruits which offer up even one more layer of additional advantage, because fruits attract animals and animals are then able to disperse fruits, and those are very good things to have. So dispersal and protection are definitely benefits or advantages or adaptations of having a seed and or having fruits around that seed. All right. Now, the seed itself is protected by what's called an integument. The integument is sporophyte tissue that typically then changes into what's called a seed coat. And the seed coat is the very, very protective layer that surrounds the embryo, as well as whatever food might be present for the embryo, and helps to protect those things. The megasporangium. Now we're going to start getting into some terms. Megasporangium, microsporangium, megaspore, microspore, megaspore mother cell, microspore mother cell. We're going to see a lot of these terms, and they're really, really, really important for you guys to understand and understand how they're produced and understand what they become as well. So the megasporangium is going to undergo meiosis inside of the ovule to make what's called a megaspore. Now, megaspores are haploid. Megaspores are what eventually give rise to the next generation of part of the life cycle of these plants, starting off with megaspores. Initially megaspore mother cells, which then give rise to megaspores through the process of meiosis, as we'll see. Megaspores become the egg, which then combine with the microspores, which become the sperm, and that will eventually form the zygote. All right, so we'll take a look at these structures in a bit of a more big picture, cohesive look at these life cycles here shortly. In terms of gametophytes, in all the seed plants, the gametophytes are very, very small, if not microscopic. So again, really, really big difference from the bryophytes, fairly big difference from the pterophytes or the ferns and their allies. Gametophytes are microscopic in the case of all seed plants. In the case of the male gametophytes, in that case we're talking about pollen, and pollen is dispersed by either wind or pollinators of some kind, either insects or birds, or sometimes bats can be pollinators as well. Very, very small, microscopic, produced by the billions by an individual plant, to help maximize that plant's chance of actually having some reproductive success, because most of the pollen granules will never, ever, ever land on a female part of another plant. They're going to land, on your roof or in your dog's nose or on a sidewalk or in a pond, and they're never going to get to where they need to go. So the plants, to have any chance of reproductive success, have to make tons and tons and tons and tons of pollen, which, if you're making that much, clearly then the pollen granules cannot be that big. Now, the other big benefit of having pollen, as opposed to what we saw with the ferns or the mosses, is that pollen doesn't need water, because the sperm cells inside the pollen are actually delivered to the female part of the plant for fertilization to take place. Remember, in those earlier plants, sperm cells had to swim. In these plants, the sperm cells are delivered by the pollen granules to the female plant right at the doorstep, so the sperm cells don't need to swim. And so, because the cells don't need to swim, that means these plants can grow in some much, much, much drier places. Kind of think of this as being the reptilian equivalent in the animal world. Plants that are able to grow in very, very dry places were able to expand very, very widely, geographically. They were able to colonize new territories and new niches and new things that plants hadn't done before, because all of a sudden they can be completely independent of free water for their sperm cells to swim. Now, they still need water to grow, but in terms of reproduction, seed plants do not need water for reproduction to occur. Now, the female gametophytes are going to develop within what's called an ovule. All right, the ovule in angiosperms is enclosed within an ovary. In gymnosperms, it's not enclosed within anything. In fact, the name gymnosperm actually means naked seed, and really what that's getting at is the ovule is not surrounded by any sort of sporophyte tissue. The ovule is just sort of exposed, either in a cone or in a flower. Not in a flower, in a cone. Gymnosperms only make cones. The ovules are exposed in the cone and not surrounded by any tissue at all. And that will make more sense as we see some pictures of that here shortly. In the angiosperms, like we said before, it's enclosed. In the gymnosperms, it's not enclosed. All right, so moving into the gymnosperms now as a group. As I mentioned a second ago, the name gymnosperm literally means naked seed, which means that the ovules are not surrounded by sporophyte tissue at all. There is a cone that they're produced in, but once that cone opens, those ovules are completely exposed to the outside environment, and there's no sporophyte tissue surrounding them. So it's not so much that there's nothing there from the beginning, but when the ovules are available for fertilization, they're not enclosed by sporophyte tissue at that point in time. So within the gymnosperms, we're going to go ahead and take a look at 4 extant groups, or not extinct groups, of gymnosperms. We're going to look at phylum names again. So we have the Coniferophyta, which are the conifers, the group that most of us are by far more familiar with than any other group. The Cycadophyta, which are a very, very small group of living fossil-type plants that have been around for hundreds of millions of years. The Gnetophyta, which are a very specialized group of plants that grow usually in desert kinds of environments. There's some unique ones there as well. And then Ginkgophyta, of which there is only a single species. So, really when we're looking at gymnosperms, worldwide, they occur in a lot of places. But in terms of numbers of species, for the Coniferophyta, there's only like 1,000 species. The Cycadophyta, there's only a few. Gnetophyta, there's only a few. And Ginkgophyta, there's only one. So it's actually a fairly small group overall within this group of gymnosperms. So gymnosperms, again, never have flowers, and they never have fruit, right? So to have a fruit, a plant must have an ovule surrounded by an ovary. Since these plants don't have their ovules surrounded by anything, we know that they can't make fruits. And you really need to remember that, because once we start looking at especially the Ginkgophyta, they are really going to look like they have fruits around their seeds, but it turns out it's not actually a fruit. It's just a very unique cone which surrounds the ovules in the case of the ginkgos, or ginkgo. So Coniferophyta, this is the one, like I said before, that's by far the most familiar to most of us, I'm sure. This includes things like pine trees and spruce trees and firs and cedars and larches and yew, not yew like Y-O-U, but yew like Y-E-W-U. All kinds of things. Juniper, that's also a conifer. Fairly familiar plants, lots and lots and lots of ecological importance, tons of economic importance as well. The conifers will grow in just about any part of the world that's not too hot or humid. They really like cold, dry conditions more than anything else. In fact, especially in places where you have a lot of topography, where you have mountains, the further down the mountain you go, the fewer conifers you find. The further up the mountain you go, the more conifers you find. So you actually, like out west in the U.S., you start off at more or less sea level, right? Like out near California, say at sea level. You're going to be around broadleaf trees, deciduous trees, like we have here. Deciduous means they drop their leaves every year, right? So they have their own version of oaks and maples and things like that. But as you start to go up the side of a mountain, those broadleaf plants start to become less and less common, and conifers start to become more and more common, because they like those cold, dry conditions that you find as you move up the side of a mountain. If you move up the mountain far enough, then you stop seeing trees altogether. So you start getting into more of like an alpine meadow type ecosystem where there aren't trees because it's too dry for any trees. And if you keep going up beyond that, eventually you just get into basically big rock fields where it's too cold and too dry and too windy for any plants to live at all. But those are pretty extreme elevations in that case. Lots of important products here, like I mentioned. If you go to your favorite hardware store or Lowe's or Home Depot or anything like that, if you go to the lumber section, 99% of the wood there is conifer. It's either going to be fir or spruce or sometimes pine, because these plants grow very fast. And so, if you compare the cost of, say, a 1 by 6 by 8 in a pine, it might be $3 or $4. If you compare the cost in oak or maple of a 1 by 6 by 8, you're going to pay probably $20 for it, because those other plants grow much slower. And for people that have those plants that sell them, once they sell them, they've got 150 years to wait before they have any more to sell, which is kind of a long time, right? So pines, on the other hand, or spruces or firs, you get a new generation that's harvestable every 30 to 40 years, in the South at least, where it's, a longer, faster growing season. Economically, it makes a lot more sense to grow a lot of that stuff. And so they grow more of it. It's cheaper. It's also a whole lot easier to work with. I do some woodworking as well, and working with pine is 10 times easier than working with any sort of hardwood like maple or oak, anything like that. It's a pain in the butt to work with it. Pine's easy. It's soft, it's pliable, it doesn't crack very easily. It's really nice to work with pine as opposed to working with any sort of like really hard, dense wood. Also, things like paper. Paper as an industry is kind of interesting. Usually, the trees that are not good enough to be turned into lumber can be harvested and ground up into pulp, which is then processed into paper or other types of fibrous products. It's a unique industry in that sense. It's also unique in the extent that it pollutes. It's very, very high up there as far as water pollution and air pollution. But a lot of these fibrous type products come from conifers as well. Resins used to be more important than they probably are now, but things like turpentine and so forth used to be really important. Taxol was a plant or a plant product that was isolated from a type of like mid-story shrub called Pacific yew out west in like Washington or Oregon. It turns out it has some very, very good anti-cancer properties, so they figured that out and they learned to synthesize it in a lab, and now Taxol is used a lot to treat things like ovarian cancer and breast cancer in particular. It's got some really strong anti-cancer properties against those. So you never know what you're going to find in a plant if you look at the chemistry of it close enough. The pines are a big group of conifers. There's about 100 species of pine. All of those are in the northern hemisphere. Most of those are in the western hemisphere, although there are some in the eastern hemisphere. But we have more over here than they have over there. About as far south as you can go and still find trees of this type, pine trees. There is a Caribbean pine that will grow, as it says, down into Central America, but not very far. And, if you go too much farther south than that, you're going to stop seeing conifers altogether. They're not really so much into those really hot, dry conditions, or really humid conditions either, for that matter. Pine trees, and this is one of those things too, like we talked about before when we covered the insects, and I said you guys were no longer allowed to call anything a bug that wasn't a bug. Kind of the same deal here, right? The tendency is for people to see what they think is an evergreen tree, and they just call all of them pines. Doesn't matter if it's a spruce, a fir, a pine. Everything that's green in the wintertime is a pine. Everything that has needles is a pine, and that's not true. The only things that are pines are things that have needles in clusters. All right, so if you see an evergreen tree and you look at it closely, if the needles come off in groups, usually of either 2 or 3 or 5, it's going to be a pine. If the needles come off individually, then it's going to be a spruce or a fir or something else, cedar perhaps, something else that's not a pine, because only pines have their needles in clusters. So from this point on, for the rest of your life, you're not allowed to call anything a pine that's not a pine. And if you do, you're going to be haunted by my voice in your head yelling at you saying that it's not really a pine if the needles don't come in clusters. These pines especially, but also spruces in particular as well, very well adapted to cold conditions, very well adapted to dry conditions. They have very, very thick cuticles, which help to waterproof the needles. They also have stomata that are recessed, which means they're kind of in little pits on the leaves, which means they're actually less prone to evaporation because the stomata are protected from the wind, so therefore evaporation is not going to be quite as much, so they don't lose as much water that way. They have several different types of chemicals in the needles that are essentially antifreeze. So one of the reasons why these plants can keep their needles all year is because their needles don't freeze. For a maple tree or an aspen tree or whatever, broadleaf tree, if their leaves freeze, they die, and the water and nutrients within those leaves are wasted as a result. Pine needles don't really freeze because of the chemistry of them, because of the other anatomical or physical features of them. They just don't freeze, so they can tolerate those dry, cold conditions very, very well. They also have resin ducts, so if you see a pine tree that's been wounded, you're going to see pitch coming out of it. The really big adaptive significance of that is that by having the pitch in the wound, it makes it really hard for insects to colonize and infect a plant that has pitch like that. It's actually toxic to insects, so they can't get in. Bacteria can't get in. Fungi can't get in as well if the wound is blocked off by pitch. All right, so we're going to take a look at pine reproduction, and then we'll get through our other groups of gymnosperms, and we'll kind of wrap up this section. All right, so things from here on out when it comes to life cycles in plants are going to get a bit gnarly for a bit. This one's not as bad, but angiosperms are a little more complicated. This one's more complicated than what we've seen so far. So we're going to work our way through this. I think in this case, let's see, I want to start with a pollen granule this time. And so the male gametophyte is the pollen. Within the pollen, there are sperm cells, 2 sperm cells, and there's also a couple of air bladders up here on the pollen granule, which makes it look kind of like a weird Mickey Mouse shape, but it also makes it light so it can float on the wind very easily. So these pollen granules, which are developed from microspores, which come from a microspore mother cell, which is located within a microsporangium, are going to eventually pollinate or land on a female cone in which there are megaspores. Right? So megaspores, there's 4 of them here. Megaspores initially come from a megaspore mother cell, which was located in a megasporangium. So same kind of terminology as the male, only males are micro, females are mega, because of the size difference, right? So once megaspores are produced, there's 4 of them. So like any other round of meiosis, you start off with 1 cell, you end up with 4 cells, right? You start off with 1 cell, you end up with 4 cells up here as well. In the case of the megaspores, 3 of the 4 spontaneously degenerate and they're reabsorbed by the plant, and that only leaves 1 megaspore left behind to become the actual female gamete. If this is pollinated, and if the sperm cells are able to get into this particular ovule and fertilize this megaspore, then you're going to have a zygote. So here we have the pollen granules landed on the female cone. There's a pollen tube growing essentially right up through here, and eventually the sperm cells of these different pollen granules are going to be delivered and able to fertilize the megaspore. All right, so once that's happened, we now have a zygote. The zygote then develops into an embryo. So now we have an embryo, which is this kind of looks like a hydra sort of, this embryo here. And around that is the seed coat, or the integument initially, but eventually the seed coat. Eventually that develops into the seed. If the seed is then dispersed and lands on the ground in a suitable place where it can grow, it's going to become a seedling, and that seedling will then grow into the next generation of sporophyte. Eventually, once it achieves sexual maturity, and in say a pine tree, it might be 20, 25 years or so, maybe a little bit shorter, depending on conditions, the sporophyte will then develop both pollen cones and ovulate cones. So some of the cones on a pine tree are male, some of the cones in a pine tree are female. The way you tell the difference is, number one, how tough they are. Male cones are very soft, leathery, papery. If you kind of crumble them between your fingers, they just come apart, they dissolve. And they're only around for a couple of weeks in the springtime. Ovulate cones, on the other hand, take a couple of years to mature, and as it says, they're woody. Right? You think about the pine cones that you find on the ground, the pine cones you rip off of a tree and throw at your brother or your sister. Those are always ovulate cones. Throwing a male cone at somebody's not going to do anything. It's bounce off and not even feel it. But ovulate cones, that's going to leave a mark. So that's the one you want to throw at your siblings. I didn't say that. Never mind. The ovulate cones are the ones that open up and eventually allow pollen grains to come in and fertilize the ovules within. So that's kind of the quick story of the cones and the life cycle. Usually, too, the female cones are higher up on a tree. Pines especially are monoecious. They tend to be both male and female. There are lots of tree species that are dioecious, but this is not one of them. This group is not dioecious. They're monoecious. Typically, the female cones are found higher up on the tree because that's going to help minimize the chances of self-fertilization. Because if pollen was up top and ovulate was on the bottom, pollen could just kind of fall down here and fertilize itself, fertilize cones on the same plant. But by having the ovulate cones up top and the male cones on the bottom, that makes it more likely for cross-fertilization to occur and for more genetic diversity to be introduced to the offspring in the next generation. All right. Now, these female cones, they're a big investment for the plant. Typically, it's going to take a minimum of 2 years for a female cone to mature to the point where it can actually be used for reproduction. The first spring after they're produced, the pollen grains land on the ovulate cones of another individual. So they blow away in the wind, they go up in the air, and eventually they kind of rain down on the female cones of other plants. And the pollen grains are going to be pulled down into what's called the micropyle, or a very, very tiny opening within the base of the ovule where the egg is actually located. At that point, the scales of the female cone close, and for about a year, nothing happens. Maybe a little bit less than a year, nothing happens. But eventually, now again, remember we've got a female cone. It's got immature ovules inside of it. Female gametophytes are still immature, but the pollen's already been introduced into the female cone. It's sort of waiting. It's sort of hanging out, waiting for this female gametophyte to mature. All the while, the pollen tube from the pollen granule is digesting its way through the outer layers of that female gametophyte as the female gametophyte is maturing. So eventually the male gametophyte gives rise to two sperm. One of those two sperm cells is going to be used to fertilize the egg about 15 months later. The other sperm cell is going to degenerate. All right, so this takes, talk about a long fertilization time. It takes like literally 15 months from pollination to fertilization. 15 months from the time the pollen lands on the ovulate cone until the time when fertilization actually happens and you start to get some zygotes produced. So really, really slow reproducing. And again, that kind of goes along with the climate they live in, cold, dry climates. You're not going to find a lot of fast life cycles in a cold, dry climate. So this life cycle goes right along with, where these plants actually live as far as how they reproduce. All right, so that's the Coniferophyta. The rest of the three groups we're going to go through really quickly and just kind of wrap up our section on the gymnosperms. The Psychedophyta, sometimes they're called sago palm. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot into the greenhouse section, they're going to have sago palms, guaranteed. They're houseplants, but they're also living fossils, and in the wild, they're actually endangered. They're very common to buy in greenhouses and households and those kinds of places. They look superficially like a palm tree, but they are not palms at all. They don't make flowers. They don't make coconuts. They're gymnosperms. These great big cones on this cycad here. This is actually a really big cycad and some ferns in the background as well. But this really big cycad has some enormous cones. The female cones in a cycad can be up to 100 pounds in size. There are some pines that can get up to that range as well, maybe 80 or 90 pounds. There are some pine trees that grow out west that produce some rather large cones as well, and those trees can be very big. They can be 200 feet tall. So do the math here. You've got a 200-foot tall tree and an 80-pound cone falling from 200 feet. That could do some damage to you or your vehicle or whatever. They produce some big cones as well, but not as big as cycads. Right? Cycads have some of the biggest cones of any plant in the world. They also have some very large sperm cells, which I guess is just trivia. I put that in just because it was kind of weird. But some other unique aspects. They're endangered in the wild. They are living fossils. They're also toxic. So public service announcement here from me. If you have pets that chew on plants, sago palms are not the way to go because they are toxic. And it doesn't take a whole lot of these to actually cause some damage to your pets if they consume them. So probably want to stay away from. They are kind of cool houseplants. They look unique. There's nothing else that really looks quite like them. But like I said, not the best if you're a cat or a dog owner, especially. Gnetophyta are the ones I talked about earlier that are more of a desert plant. They really like living in deserts. Dry conditions, extreme conditions for any other plant. These plants do just fine. This one in this picture is called Welwitschia. And Welwitschia is a plant that, in the picture, looks awful. It looks like the plant is just dying. It's like a heap of just dead, rotting, half dried out vegetation. But that plant's actually healthy. You get a sense for the cones up here as well. But these plants actually have some of the deepest roots of any plant because of where they live. They produce some massively, massively deep roots that tap into water supplies that are very, very deep in the ground, so they can actually survive in places because they can find that water that other plants can't get to. Ephedra is another one that actually it's kind of an interesting plant. I found some of this last summer when I was out west hiking around in Utah, and ephedra is one where, if you've ever heard of ephedrine or pseudoephedrine, first off, that was initially found and isolated from the ephedra plant. So it's a stimulant. It's also used a lot in decongestants, pseudoephedrine, Sudafed. It's sometimes brewed in a tea. You actually do that if you're out camping and you need some caffeine to wake you up in the morning. You can actually boil ephedra in some boiling water, and it makes a it's not the best tasting thing, but it will definitely wake you up. Um, so it's got some interesting uses, sort of medicinally as well, I guess you could say. Needham is another one. I don't think I have any pictures of Needham in this lecture, but it's another needophyte, which is it's they're all of these are very unique looking plants. And then ginkgo, the one remaining species of ginkgo in the world, Ginkgo biloba, is a gymnosperm that has flagellated sperm, so that is absolutely unique. There are no other gymnosperms like that. It is dioecious, so there are separate male and female plants for ginkgo. The picture that you see here is a male ginkgo plant. Actually, no, this is a female, I'm sorry. This is a female ginkgo plant that produces these white, what almost look like fruits or cherries almost, but they're actually cones. So this is the one that I cautioned you before. Just because it looks like it has fruits on it doesn't automatically mean that it's an angiosperm, because this one is actually a gymnosperm. Now, if you pay attention at all, you're going to notice that this plant is different from any other plant you're ever going to see. First off, look at the shape of the leaves. The leaves are fan-shaped, and there are no other plants that have anything even close to a leaf that looks like this. The female plants, like we said, have these cones that are fleshy. They are supposedly edible if you prepare them the right way, but they smell absolutely terrible, especially when they fall off the plant and start to rot. It smells like the worst rotting, rancid milk smell you've ever kind of imagined in your life. So much so that a lot of times when people plant these, they only plant the male trees because males produce little tiny pollen cones that don't smell like anything, whereas the females make these big, nasty, gross cones that when they fall on the sidewalk and people step on them and they rot, it reeks. Like when I was teaching at a school before I came to Lakeland, there was a male and female ginkgo plant on either side of the sidewalk over by the dorms, and there were all these complaints every fall because of these quote unquote fruits that were coming down. They smelled really bad. Of course, they weren't fruits at all. They were ginkgo cones. But eventually, I came into work one day and noticed that the female tree was gone because they had cut it down. They finally had enough complaints. They decided it was time to cut down the one tree, and they just left the male standing there by itself at that point in time. Ginkgo actually nearly went extinct a few hundred years ago in China, where it's native. There was a Chinese monastery where some monks took in a few of these trees and grew them within the walls of the monastery while they were going extinct everywhere else. They took care of them, and then eventually they began to plant them places. And now ginkgos are found everywhere in the world. We have ginkgos on campus at Lakeland. They're a really, really good urban tree because they don't mind air pollution, they don't mind soil compaction. They're very tolerant, they're very resistant, and they're very pretty, honestly. So they make a really, really nice tree for planting on campuses and in parks and along city streets and those kinds of things because they don't mind all the stuff that comes along with living in those kinds of conditions, all the negative effects of those conditions. They're perfectly cool with it. So that's ginkgo. We're gonna wrap up this section here, and we pick up with our final section of this lecture. We will be looking at the angiosperms.